We're on air tonight? Monday, May 14th study session of the Littleton Planning Commission. Quite frankly, your chair is incapacitated. I've been driving all day. I've got a cold. I can't decompress, so I'm suffering from Wolf Creek Pass, trying to clear my ears. So, I'm going to turn it over to Vice Chair Bruce to run the show. I'm here to give comment, and I was away for 2 weeks on vacation, but I've read the material, so take it away, sir.
Thanks. Hope you're feeling better.
Yes.
It's not good. Jocelyn, I guess a couple quick questions. We'll turn it over to you guys. You can make the introductions, and then why don't you give the context for what we're doing tonight is in terms of the draft review. Is it coming back to us again before it goes to council in July, or what is the overall timing? So, if you please.
Want to answer, Dennis, or we
Sure.
get started?
Sure.
But yes, the answer is yes. It's coming back to you officially. This is
for a public hearing.
Yes, correct. Yes. So, well, I guess as you guys know, last year, at this point, it seems like a long time ago, right? Council directed us to take on a corridor plan for this area of the city since we do not have anything at the moment. So that then led to us hiring Clarion to assist us in this project. And we've had a bunch of, we had a vision meeting with neighborhood to get this started about what did they see, what were their hopes, dreams, desires for the future of this area. Then that followed up with taking all that information. We had it online and coming up with a draft plan and concepts. You guys have seen it before. You did look at that draft plan. So from there, right, Dennis, we took that information and it was posted again on Littleton Plans for more community input. And the result is the plan that you have in front of you this evening. With that, do you have anything else you want to add, Dennis?
No, I think we've had three open houses, as Jocelyn said. So we had the first one for the concepts and kind of the issues, and then we had the draft in terms of here the kind of what we're looking at in terms of general policies and goals, and then more specific for the third one, and had a response from each one has been great. So.
With that, I guess we'll turn it over to Darcy and Son.
All right, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. We visited with this group last in February. I know several of you have been at some of our community meetings, so we appreciate that. But I also understand there's some folks who are new to the table, and so we'll give a little bit more background in terms of kind of some of the components of the plan, and it's a lot to digest. So I will also highlight as we go through some of the changes. This group, we had a great discussion when we were here in February, a lot of good feedback, so I'll try to highlight some of the changes that we made in response to the Planning Commission feedback as well. But just as a kind of quick recap, Jocelyn mentioned this is a corridor plan. This basically functions as an element or kind of supplement to your comprehensive plan. So that's the citywide plan. This gives you more detailed policy guidance for a specific area of the city. So there are other plans that we look to as part of this that help inform this, a whole host of them actually, ranging from the neighborhood plans that exist for this area to the bike and ped plan, but especially the South Platte River Corridor vision. And we talked a lot about that last time we were here and have really tried to bring in a lot more of those components to really try to link those two more strongly, which was a suggestion that you guys had, which made a lot of sense, and we've tried to carry that out. So in terms of overall process, we are in the home stretch. This is kind of what we're calling the final review draft. And certainly if you guys have additional comments tonight, we will be tracking those and presenting those when we talk with council next week if there's items that we need to discuss further before we move forward. But the overall goal is shooting to wrap up in the July timeframe. So Jocelyn mentioned we had multiple opportunities for input. I think particularly I think this is something we see a lot in the planning work that we do, where we have kind of these, peaks and valleys in terms of the engagement. And, certainly the middle stage where we had, the bulk of the preliminary recommendations to share, that was the meeting we had, I think 150 people attend. We had a lot more input online. The last meeting was not as well attended, which is pretty consistent with what we typically see. People want to know what you're up to, how are you going to respond to our questions, and they don't always kind of stick with it all that time, but we've had consistent feedback throughout. In terms of the overall plan recommendations, there's really kind of 4 components to the plan in terms of the chapters to kind of talk about. The corridor vision and principles, which really apply to the corridor as a whole, and these are really kind of drawing from those initial community meetings that staff led back in October, and some of the key ideas. So those we get into, I'll talk about those in a minute, but down into goals and policies, and those are the types of things you'll use in day-to-day planning. We also get into, because of the scale of this corridor, into some specific, what we call opportunity areas, which are kind of more land use recommendations, as well as recommendations for specific corridor enhancements. So getting into some of the sidewalk improvements, and we'll touch on, kind of those types of things more in a moment. And then last, but perhaps most importantly, thinking about implementation. And that was the piece we hadn't yet drafted when we were here a few months ago. So in terms of the vision and principles, so there are 5 overarching principles for the corridor. The vision statement itself is something that this group had some feedback on. Staff really kind of went back through the comments, took some time to kind of rework that to try to make it a little bit more, and I can't remember the exact words that the chair used at our last meeting, but personable is just more fitting in terms of kind of the community's voice, I think is generally the direction that you were talking about. So we'll be anxious for your feedback on that. But in terms of the principles, these are really kind of the big ideas that really help implement and support the vision. So the first of those is thinking about the identity of the corridor. And this is something that we talked about both from the standpoint of Bellevue Avenue itself, so the actual right-of-way of Bellevue Avenue and what that feels like to the community as a destination, but then also looking at the neighborhoods and kind of all of the areas around that. So when we look at the corridor study area, it's a much larger area that kind of feeds into Bellevue Avenue. So we look at kind of different aspects of that throughout the plan. Mobility and safety, huge part of the discussion with the community. This is a big concern. Bellevue is a big road, not surprisingly, so that's a big issue. But we've also really looked at all of the north-south connections through the corridor. But one of the big kind of gaps from the community's perspective is those east-west connections. And we've really focused on it from the standpoint of pedestrian and bicycle connections, trying to make those safer, creating kind of that, more of a grid through the kind of east-west through the corridor to kind of provide some other options for folks without having to funnel all of that pedestrian and bike traffic onto Bellevue. So since that's not the most friendly place, I'll try to work in some other options. Looking at connections to the Greenway was also a really big part of what we focused on. So kind of connecting all the pieces within the corridor and the destinations within the corridor. Thinking also about corridor neighborhoods, and this is something that really came out in the October meetings that staff held, is that what people really like about living in this area is that sense of place in the neighborhoods. A lot of folks have lived there for a long time, but we also talked to a lot of young families at the open houses that we've had who are really interested in, how is this area going to change and be more suitable for folks like us? And so, what kind of places might we go? How do we build on that long-standing neighborhood character? So there are goals and policies that support that. In terms of what, both the multifamily aspects that's kind of centered on the golf course, as well as places like Arapahoe Hills, which have very distinct character. And then another kind of big theme was really looking at supporting existing businesses and revitalizing the underutilized properties. A lot of people commented, This is a 1960s corridor that some properties have seen better days, certainly, and we've talked a lot about some of those specific corridors or specific properties, but we dive into some of those distinct opportunities. So one way to look at this corridor is that it's mostly built out, has limited opportunities, but when you really start to dig into how might we make better use of some of the existing properties in the corridor? What can we encourage in terms of revitalization, whether that's just rehabbing existing buildings or wholesale redevelopment, as we have in the case of Columbine Square? We need to look at all of those things, and this is important from the standpoint of just creating a sense of place and vitality, but also from the standpoint of continuing to support the city's tax base and really think about the health of retail. One of the things we also talked about with this group last time, we have been working with the economic consultant, EPS, who did a retail analysis for the corridor, and that really helped inform, kind of where we went with this. And a big part of that was the recognition that retail is changing. Not a big surprise to anyone around the table, but that's really going to mean changes in land use, and we need to kind of anticipate that and kind of try to encourage those changes over time. So a broader mix of uses is likely what we're going to see in many of these cases versus pure retail situation going forward. And then lastly, the last principle really focuses on creating more places for people. And this is really, again, going directly back to the feedback we heard from the community that, the destinations that exist in the corridor today, people really value, and they want more of that, and they want it to be easily accessible to their neighborhood. So as you're thinking about improvements, creating those smaller opportunities is something that can go a long way in terms of creating destinations for people, creating that active neighborhood environment, and really making the most too of the Greenway Trail in that corridor. So touching on the corridor recommendations, there are kind of two types of areas: the opportunity areas, which we flagged as both near-term and long-term opportunities, and then the corridor enhancements, which kind of focus on those connectivity, safety elements that I talked about. So this is where we get into kind of looking at the specific map locations of the corridor. There are 9 different areas that we've looked at, and they're all pretty different, and so there are some different groupings. We spent a lot of time talking about and focusing on Columbine Square in the plan for good reason. This is kind of one of the biggest opportunities. It's centrally located, and it's a very active conversation with the community. So a lot of the feedback and the conversations we had at community meetings were really geared towards this and curiosity about what's going to happen, and different perspectives on that. And so we did talk with the property owner, the developer for this site, and made sure that the recommendations that are in this plan are consistent with the general direction that they're headed in terms of the opportunities that they see for that site in the long term. So we've tried to capture that. And then we've also looked at some of the other sites. Opportunity Area 2, Tenniel Square. This is another one that, during the time we worked on the study, the property's changed hands. They're making some improvements. So just trying to reinforce that those types of changes are positive, as well as wholesale redevelopment in other cases. Riverside Downs, this is a center that people, there's a lot of things they really like about it, but there's also some opportunity there to make better use of that river frontage where you've now got surface parking. There's been some landscape enhancements and pedestrian improvements, but how do you activate that space further? And so there's some recommendations there that, if someone comes in the future wants to do some infill along that edge, that might be something that the city wants to consider to activate that space even further. Rocko Square and Tenniel Plaza, this is basically kind of a little neighborhood center that, again, I think this is a destination for the community. The pizza joint, the haircutting place, people really like this little center. And so the idea here is just work with them. Your economic development folks are already kind of helping them with some facade improvements and, creating that, continuing to maintain that as long as you can. If you have if ultimately that comes forward as a redevelopment opportunity, we have included some recommendations about, how do you make that sensitive to the single-family neighborhoods and the park going forward. So you've kind of got short and long-term considerations there. We've also flagged some of our long-term opportunity areas. Some of these are in Littleton, but there are some that are in Inglewood. And there were a lot of questions about that at the community meetings. And I think as we were looking at the corridor as a whole, we did sit down with the City of Littleton staff early in the process, kind of talked about what their plans were for the area, maybe what some of the long-term opportunities might be. I think the idea of having these things in a plan that the City of Littleton has, if there is an opportunity in the future to have a conversation about a future roadway connection, for example, to take Prince Street to the north, that would be something that, having it in the plan gives you the kind of basis to have those conversations and see if you can move something forward. So it's really kind of a catch those opportunities and if they come up, and it may be 5 years, it may be 20 years, but at least you've got a foundation for the discussion when it's the time is right. So moving into the corridor enhancements, a lot of different types of things. We work closely with Public Works on this section in particular in terms of trying to mesh with projects that they already have underway, things that they know they're planning to do and may have opportunity to work on, as well as to capture some of the bigger ideas that the community had as placeholders for future evaluation through the CIP or other projects. So this little diagram, map E, kind of gets into a lot of the details. There's a bit more narrative about the different types of things. So, for the most part, you've been careful not to kind of predetermine specific. There's going to be a median that's 6 feet wide, and it's going to go from here to here. What we've tried to do is capture those locations where the opportunities exist. The engineering staff really feels like those are viable and could be explored further. But recognition was that those types of things are changing all the time, and if you put in some real specific parameters that maybe that's not the exact best solution when you have the time or the resources to actually build that. So there's a little bit of flexibility built in there. An example would be on those east-west connections. So the little orange kind of shaded areas on Irving and Federal, the recognition is you need better east-west connection there. Specifically, what type of crossing makes sense and where along that stretch will need to be determined kind of based on a real site-specific analysis. This map also gets into and identifies a lot of the greenway enhancements, and many of those really do kind of speak to the South Platte River vision specifically and kind of carry forward some of those ideas. So it tries to link those two together a little bit more closely. And then just kind of quick orientation on the implementation section. I think, one of the things you'll notice in the plan, we've got kind of policy level guidance. We've also got some specific improvements. So this really tries to build on that. Some of that in terms of tying in, kind of what those next steps are. This is really something that would be used to help guide future investment in the corridor. So if the city has an opportunity, whether through the CIP process or a grant or some other type of thing, you have something in here to guide those next steps in terms of these are the improvements the community would like to see. And some of them will require kind of additional planning or changes to the code, for example. So you'll see the matrices in there. There's one for each of the kind of the big ideas, the guiding principles. And these are specific strategies that the city can look at either on its own or in partnership with others. I think we really tried to emphasize, you've got a lot of different folks who have different roles within this corridor in terms of their work, and trying to work together on that and make sure that you're kind of making the most of the resources that are out there. So As an example, one of the regulatory strategies, we've got some design principles in there kind of related to some different locations within the corridor, and so the idea would be, as they stand now in the plan, those are basically guidelines that could be used in the review process. You do have the option, if you wanted to formalize those, create them as part of your code or formal design standards. That would be kind of the next step that you could take to codify those. Program example, we did work with the city's economic development staff, and there's a lot of work that they're already doing in the corridor, and so some of the programmatic recommendations really look to build on their work and continue to support that going forward. So working with the businesses and kind of building awareness of once the plan is completed. Part of it is helping people understand that it's out there, how is it going to be used, how will it be implemented, and so there's some outreach that will be continuing once the plan is completed as well. Another example just in terms of kind of day-to-day policy guidance, so similar to the comprehensive plan, the citywide plan, this plan really should be used as a supplemental tool when you have projects that come into the corridor. So you can now pick it up, look at it, kind of say, all right, here's what we heard from the community, here's what our policies are. So it's another tool that you have to support the implementation of the different types of development that you'd like to see in the corridor. So that's just kind of a quick overview. And then wanted to end in terms of some of what we've heard and maybe kind of how the plan addresses this. And Dennis did a great job kind of summarizing kind of what we've heard and where it's addressed in the plan. I think, there's definitely an interest in a lot of these ideas that we've talked about. Not everyone agrees on every point, and we would expect that. But I think some of the common themes that I touched on earlier, safety for vehicles and pedestrians, it's a big deal, and that's been a big focus of what we've talked about. Connectivity, also a big focus. And then looking at the assets that you have in the corridor, so that's kind of both the habitat and the greenway, the parks, community spaces, all of those things. Neighborhood character, we've got a whole section on that, and a whole variety of things. So I think we've tried to be comprehensive in terms of responding to the community, recognizing that we're not going to have 100% consensus on every idea that carries forward. But I think these were definitely the common themes that we've heard, and we've really tried to focus on in the plan. Anything else you'd add on that, Dennis?
No, this is just a sample of the things we have in there. There's a lot more that like this.
So, in terms of next steps, we do have we'll kind of document what we've heard, what we hear tonight in our discussion. We are going to go back to council next Tuesday and have a work session with them. And then the plan is to come back to you guys in early June and then go back to into city council in July. So that's the tentative time frame for here. So I will stop there, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Question, Jocelyn. So we're not having the joint study session, but council is looking at the
That's correct.
plan.
Yes.
Okay.
Is it fair at this juncture to say, it looks pretty complete, we'll obviously give input. There's no missing pieces from your guys' perspective that we would anticipate would enter in here absent tonight or council saying, hey, what about such and such? Okay, so this is pretty complete for context.
Yep.
Okay. Do you want to go first in case you want to take off? Well,
I'll hang in there for the entire.
Okay, all right.
I'm good.
All right, then.
Can we do it rather than just have everybody comment, go through the whole thing, each person? Could we go by sections and then you
Sure. Yeah.
all comment per section? I think that'd be more.
Why don't we do that then?
Better use of our time.
Can you make some general comments beforehand?
General comments? Yeah, I think general comments are fine. then we'll get into the specifics section by section.
Any general comments?
Brought it up. Go ahead.
Surprise, surprise. Actually, first I have a question for Jocelyn or Dennis. So when we got the little bit of public comment we got, I was surprised it wasn't very much. You know, like after the Mineral Station when we had like over 100 pages of comments we could review and, you know, kind of check to see what the community was saying. But, you know, in this case, we just had that, I think 4 or 5 people's comments. And then I appreciated what Dennis, what you had done with people are interested in, but I think as a planning commissioner, I would have liked to have seen that before tonight, because that would have been really helpful to look at that and then to compare it back and forth with the plan. So I feel a little left out in the sense of not knowing a lot of those comments to be able to place it back into this plan. So
just to clarify, so the comments, we did get them online, so you had them with the document, or am I not?
right, but that was like 4 people's comments.
It was a pretty good amount.
There was 10 pages of 4 people's
10 pages.
comments.
Yes.
So
It's 4 people.
the middle round that we had was about 100. It was a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
And
we
it's
didn't
fairly
see
typical, I
that.
think, that we get those comments kind of early on, and then I think if people feel like they've been heard, we get fewer comments typically. So,
Right, but
so
we didn't
hopefully
get to
that's
see
what it
that.
is. Yeah, right.
That's all I like to see, because, you know, you guys are intensely involved, and, you know, I go to the meetings, but I don't get the information you guys hearing from the community, so that's all.
Recognize that a lot of it was at the meeting. The comments, I believe, were all of the written comments that we received from the beginning of this plan. So there's not like there's a missing middle of extra comments.
Okay, so the only comments that I saw in here was basically the stuff we got online that came from 4 people. Was there more that perhaps didn't make it on there?
So I guess I'll have to look at it, because this is
Yeah.
my packet of comments.
Yeah, I don't think that's the same thing I got.
Oh, it should be, yeah.
It should be, so.
If you didn't.
So when I look at here, the comments, it's 10 pages and it's answered by 4 people. And it looks like just Open Littleton.
And is it by question or by person?
It looks like it, let's see, let me go back to the top. It's what thoughts or feedback do you have relating to chapter 1 and then chapter 2. But it looks like it's just Open Littleton stuff and just 4 people's comments. That's all. At least that's all I see here in our, you know, what we got in our.
Well, when we worked on the Santa Fe light rail station, we had the raw public input that covered 80 to 100 pages. Is there something like that available? Or just raw questions, raw
That's
comments?
from earlier, yeah, absolutely, we can do that. So,
Can you?
But not from this round. Not from this round, so.
Well, we haven't received any public comment at all in any of the rounds. So I could see where you're thinking, oh, just this round.
Right.
But I was looking for all of it, and we
Each
never
earlier,
received
okay.
any of
I'm
it
sorry, I thought we-
up till this. So I can see the confusion.
Okay.
Is that something easily put out?
Oh, absolutely, you bet.
Oh, lovely. It'd be nice to take a look at it.
Miscommunication, because that was 100% the intention.
Yeah.
Yes, I do think so. Again, you know, working in those things. So that was my first question. So overall, I found it aesthetically pleasing. You know, it had the maps were very nice. Appreciated the work you'd done in the connectivity, the pedestrian, the river, considerations for more north-south roadways, the economic. Those were all really helpful, and I found that part all very positive. On the other hand, my concerns were it really feels like a generic template that just puts Littleton words into it. It could be anywhere USA. A lot of it isn't measurable. You know, some of the things are measurable. You had the things about the connectivity and the pedestrian, the bikes, but there wasn't any outcomes defined. How is this outcome going to come together? You have all these different pieces, but no really description on how these outcomes fit what is going on. I feel like the identity lacks specificity, and really there's no description of actual character. There's comments about character being residential or commercial, but that's not really describing the character. That's just saying it's residential or commercial. And the character outcome this plan, it isn't included, and it's really important because character, of course, is what we're talking about for this whole corridor. And I felt that whole area of character was very lacking in how that would come across. I didn't see where it was stated what the residents wanted for community character and how that was going to be achieved. You know, one of the things we saw with Kendig and Keast is they have measurable community character. And it's very specific, and there's a chart that they use, and there's nothing like that in here. And I'm really concerned because the word character is always thrown around, but what does it really mean? And there's no true description of that. I was really concerned were some of the places where the character or land use was changed, specifically looking at Columbine Square and the Rocko Center at Tenniel Plaza. The implementation was very slim. Again, I'm looking for outcome, and I'm not seeing it in here. Lots of ideas, lots of words, but nothing that pulls it together. It doesn't have lots of concrete ideas. I found it very nebulous. Something where anything could be built, anything could be allowed. And quite frankly, I'm concerned there's more harmful elements than beneficial elements at this point. I felt like it ignored the residents at that first meeting. The local residents were really concerned about density, traffic, and intensity. And it is very cursory mentioned in here, the congestion concerns. So I see this as a very mixed bag. I have lots of concerns. And there's a part of me that's looking at this thinking we're about to go through, our vision comp plan, and with an organization that really knows how to connect to the community in a manner that they can spend so much more time in it than perhaps is allocated for this. And I'd almost like to come and see what comes out of that before going forward with this, just to make this a more meaningful document that isn't so nebulous. So those are my kind of summation.
Any other general overview comments? Sure.
Got a couple. I missed out on the whole process. Basically, I didn't see, and I did see a comment about the disconnect between this area and downtown Littleton or the rest of Littleton. And clearly, we have that huge barrier of Santa Fe Drive, right, that separates our community. But I don't really see anything in here that addresses how there might be a connection there, if it's desired by the community. I did see a comment or two about at one point it was connected. Some residents felt like, but there's no comment whatsoever in mobility about it. So I'm just curious if that issue was looked at, will it be looked at? Are we just going to...
So we looked at it primarily from the standpoint of pedestrian connections across Santa Fe, and so the discussions about signage and kind of orientation, because I think one of the things that's somewhat confusing as you come from, not everyone knows that you can get to the Bellevue corridor from downtown Littleton, and so that was really where we came at it, was from the standpoint of having that wayfinding signage to kind of link those pieces together. Downtown wasn't a huge focus for this in terms of what we heard. I think some of the comments we heard early on when we mentioned it actually were, that's, you don't want to recreate downtown, we're not trying to recreate that or compete with that, but that it's also pretty far removed, and that, as a corridor, the community felt pretty far removed from downtown. So we focus more on kind of the specific wayfinding and kind of tangible connection, but that was really the primary focus.
But is there a desire by community members to have more access to downtown? I mean, you can't walk, it's very difficult to walk over here from over there. Mm-hmm. There's no way to cross Santa Fe without risking your life that I know of. Very few ways. So I just wondered, I just thought that was a missing piece.
The other way that came up through the early conversations, and this was a carryover from the neighborhood plans, was the idea of having some sort of east-west transit connection. So most of the bus, connections all run north-south. So having that connection to the rail on the east side, and that ultimately would connect you to downtown. I think there was some skepticism about, how viable that was in terms of ridership. So those are the different ideas that were kicked around.
About pedestrian overpass.
we have an at-grade pedestrian crossing, so at Santa Fe. So I think that's where the focus was on how do we make that safer and more inviting for people, more clear that that connection exists. But yeah, the idea of an overpass didn't come up. That wasn't something that came up.
That seems to be part of the reason there might be an identity issue in general, but it's just kind of, that area is just, it's over there, and it is an interesting and different area. But I have just one more comment, and that is on the actual timeframes and kind of the action plan, that I didn't see any long-term timeframes, and I don't think that's realistic to say that all this is either short-term or, of course, ongoing could mean long-term, it could mean forever, right? That's what it means. But I don't see anything that's a long-term go. And in the planet comment, there was a comment about this is maybe, I think, up to a 10-year look. And realistically, it seems there should be things that honestly should be more of a long-term, 7 to 10 or whatever that is. Because and I like action plans, of course. I like to see, although I see that I'm just kind of scratching the surface there, which is understandable. But I just wonder how realistic that is. And when I zip through there, I see community development league, community development league, community development league, and we're going to have numerous plans. And given the size of the staff and resources, and I just wonder, is that realistic, and should that be modified? Honestly. Those are my comments.
Anyone else?
Well, I've seen dozens of these corridor studies, both prepared by Littleton and prepared by other communities that we get as examples as we do ours. This one has more specificity than pretty much any one we've done in Littleton in the past, whether it be Broadway that never got adopted, Littleton Boulevard never got adopted, Santa Fe that was fairly nebulous at the time. So in my mind, how far do you go without over-analyzing, overdoing, specifying what the width of the sidewalks are going to be in parcel 14? It's a balancing act. Let's see. And we don't know as a planning commission how much money the city's going to put in, what's their input, what's their drive, guts, glory, and action from council, and where's the money come from. We also have to balance this with the use by right of individual property owners, the existing zoning. A lot of properties, they could look at this and says, that's very nice, but here's my B2 zoning, this is what I intend to do, and go directly to the building department and apply for a permit. The struggle with these plans are always how far, how much, let's say law does this carry versus the overriding, underlying, let's say, zoning. Anyway, those are my general comments.
Okay. Anybody? Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, sure. And I'm new to this process too, so I'll first I have a question. One is there was mention that one of the comparisons was the bike and ped plan, and just looking at them side by side, it seems like the bike and ped plan was a little bit weak in this area along Bellevue. Did anything come out of that as far as tying it or strengthening what was in the bike and ped plan, especially on the bike side? The ped plan obviously focused on filling gaps in the sidewalk and the pedestrian, detaching sidewalks and that type of thing, but I didn't see much on the bicycle options other than maybe finding a future opportunity for parallel routes.
That was actually an area where the city's doing a whole lot already, in talking with Public Works. So it's really the, what's the name of that street? Centennial Drive and Prince Street. So one of the things that Public Works is trying to do to kind of leverage the city's limited resources is look at implementing, how do we make change the existing right-of-way that we have to make it more friendly for bicycles. And so, the example would be the Prince Street and Centennial Drive. They're doing some repaving in that area, resurfacing now or in the near future. And so they're already kind of trying to implement some of the ideas that came out of the bike and ped plan, and finding ways to make things happen. And so I think in terms of new connections that came from the bike ped plan to here, I think it was really trying to pull in some of those things that are already happening. Also, some of the safe routes to schools work that Public Works is doing, and that's primarily on the south side, kind of. Along Berry. So there's already some interchange or intersection improvements that they're doing, and that's a case of where the city is trying to work with these different partners to implement kind of little bits and pieces and tie it all together. And so, so there were definitely some new things that came out of those conversations that, we're already doing these things to address some of these issues. And to kind of flag those as something that's happening. But beyond that, anything else you'd mention on that, Son?
No, I know earlier in the process we did look at the bike and ped plan, and from what I can tell, this current plan of recommendations kind of builds on top of that, and the recommendations go further. Instead of a shared lane, I think with the restriping, they're having more of a dedicated route along Centennial Drive too, so improvements there.
Okay. Yeah, the gaps are significant. And at Lowell, south of Bellevue, and even I strongly feel that west of Lowell. I don't know what the neighborhood said because I wasn't here, but west of Lowell, why don't we have sidewalks up there? At least up to Perry, which I think is the last one before you get into Beaumar. The neighborhood connections there are not very good. So just some other observations based on my prior experience with these types of plans. First of all, I like the way it's organized and the look of the document. I think it reads really well. I like all that. Some of the things that I didn't see emphasized very strongly were and maybe they don't belong in this plan, are the types of land use redevelopment where you have buildings anchoring corners. We have a lot of the land uses that are out there, like the Walgreens and so on, that have parking in front of them and the buildings set back. And, really, as the best practice is to really design those corners so they're more pedestrian friendly, so you can get the buildings right up to the corners like they did at Bellevue and Broadway, for instance, in Englewood. So it might be addressed in there. I didn't see it emphasized. And then I'm a landscape architect, so my interest is in street trees and making, using the landscape to make it more pedestrian friendly, maybe taking some of the width out of the lanes so that you can widen the sidewalks or detach the sidewalks and get continuous street trees. Although there's not much shade out there, it's a brutal pedestrian environment just from the traffic, but if you separate the pedestrians from the vehicle traffic and give them some shade, it could be a good place. It's a good start. I've seen some good projects that have instigated redevelopment by just good streetscaping. And then, so those are just some general observations that I have. Sections as we go through.
Yep. John or Jason, you guys want to opine?
Wait till the sections.
Okay, all right then. Let's proceed with chapter 1. Anybody have any specific comments? You're up.
Is that the setup?
Yeah, I think so. Ties a little bit in with the comments on the bicycle lane, and there's certainly some opportunities to improve bicycle and pedestrian access in the area. And one of the related plans and studies, this may not have been adopted by the city of Littleton, but in 2017, Arapahoe County adopted a bicycle and pedestrian master plan that city of Littleton staff did help in developing, that actually identified some very specific improvements in this corridor area. Things like looking at Irving Street as perhaps being a bicycle corridor for like a shared, the Sharo they call it, just identify it as a bike route basically. Recommended buffered bike lanes on Federal, some improvements to the side paths on Bellevue. which I think are covered elsewhere in the plan, where it talks about just generally improving the character of Bellevue for pedestrians. But there's some fairly specific suggestions in that, so that might be worth adding to the related plans and studies.
Other comments for the introduction, chapter 1? Go ahead.
So looking under the issues, one of the things I see missing here is one of the citizens, particularly in the first meeting, they really talked about their density concerns, or their intensity concerns, and I didn't really see that highlighted here or brought up.
Is that something that was brought up as a present state? That there's too much now?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
And then, of course, there are concerns for how it would affect them in the future, because, if they have concerns about something right now, they don't know in the future, because that'll be affected, that sort of stuff. You do mention the traffic volumes, but looking at how you were writing some of the other issues, it almost seemed like perhaps saying things like needed enhancing the roads to deal with the congestion, just to bring up the citizens' concerns there.
And I think the second to the last bullet on the development compatibility, sensitivity to the neighborhoods was, you could say density specifically there. That's really what that was geared towards, I think, is kind of in response to that.
I'm just checking my notes as we go through here.
Robin, was that a comment directed at the corridor broadly, or more specifically perhaps Columbine Square?
No, it's the corridor. This was, in that vision, the first one, where the people are talking very generally about their community.
Okay.
That's really all I have for that right there.
Anything else on chapter 1?
Yeah, on the opportunities, just following that issues on page 3. They're pretty brief, the bullets, and it seems like they could be improved by adding some kind of action statement to describe potential opportunities a little bit more. Rather than, it's like existing local businesses. What about existing local businesses? Improve opportunity, specific things for. If there's any kind of more specific things we could add to improve those bullets without turning them into big paragraphs.
So we've got in the existing conditions report, kind of a whole page on each of these topics. So we were trying to boil it down,
right,
but we can try to find a middle ground there.
Maybe bring a little bit of that more forward. I think that it's just a comment.
So would you add any other bullets, or just expand on the bullets that are there?
Just kind of expand and see if they can bring a little bit more from the existing conditions appendix into those bullets.
Okay.
The opportunities.
Anybody else? Chapter 2, about the corridor, and this is relatively factual-based information. Anybody have any suggestions or feedback for chapter 2?
I love the corridor timeline. Kind of put the corridor in perspective of 1920s to today. It was really made it more interesting compared to what's going on today.
I thought so too. I don't want to rush you guys, but if nobody has any, we'll continue to push on. So chapter 3.
By the way, spelling errors, gaps, and things of that nature, we could go on forever with that. Somebody mentioned in an email they would send, I think it was David, he would send them off to you.
All right, so chapter 3 is vision and principles, which is probably starting to get into a little bit more of the meaty areas for feedback. Who wants to go first? Why don't we go around the horn then? Sherry, you got any comments?
Not at the moment.
Okay, John?
Okay, on page 15, the opening paragraph I would like to see it strengthened, that opening, by adding a statement that I think it would add clarity to say that the retail corridor along Bellevue lacks a cohesive character, and that's kind of gives a context for what follows. And so in that goal ID-1, establish West Bellevue Avenue as a distinct destination, maybe a more distinct destination, because it does lack some distinction. And then on the goal ID 2, on the other side of that page, the word enhance is used quite frequently throughout the document. So it seems like it can be improved somewhat. So it's like if improve or some other words to just take the frequency of enhance, the repetition, out a little bit for readability. And then following on, Principle 3, that opening paragraph at the top that goes across, it says diverse housing options, distinct character. I think there's a distinct neighborhood character would be good to add to that opening paragraph. And under policy NR-1.1 neighborhood compatibility, opening sentences ensure that residential infill and redevelopment is compatible with I think existing character instead of just character. Would improve that section. Then finally on the principle 4 on page 18, just kind of had a general comment about looking into adding some more details on appropriate multifamily housing and where it is acceptable or just deemed something that the community wants in that last housing section policy part.
Can I ask a clarifying question on that one?
Sure.
So 3.2, I think we kind of made a clarification last time, that primarily east of Irving where additional multifamily are you suggesting a separate policy altogether, or?
No, I think there's possibility it's going to be in the Columbine Square too. So that kind of leaves that out.
Okay.
And I think that would kind of needs to, so that's not the only area, is that Irving.
Yep. Okay.
That's where most of it is right now. It's kind of going in Plat 56 development, so there's a few other areas where it's cropping up, and I think that's okay, but some people may disagree with that, but if it's down in the plan, so
Sure.
it kind of says, okay, we're being realistic about where this kind of change is happening, and with that in those sections where it's mentioned. And then finally, Principle 5, creating gathering places. This goes on to another section in the corridor section, but I think one of the huge thing that could be done that would really hit this desire of the community is from Bellevue and going upstream under Prince Street Bridge up towards Bowles, the grading is very flat in the river, and the river is very wide, been engineered by the Army Corps of Engineers to convey high flows, and there's not a lot going on in the river right there. And if there was a low water impoundment put in there in the future, that would create ponds in that area, or one large pond that could back the river up for quite a ways, it would be a huge recreational resource for the community that could be accessed at Riverside Downs. And people would bring their canoes, their kayaks, their inner tubes, their paddle boards to use that. And it also could be designed to, and higher flows to convey the water over to a surfing feature for whitewater enthusiasts.
So point of clarification on that, I think anything that has to do with the river is probably part and parcel of the South Platte Working Group and the state and South Suburban Parks and Rec. I mean, we really don't. I think what you're describing is certainly interesting, but they have a whole master plan for that area. I don't think that's necessarily within the scope of what we're trying to accomplish here. I understand why you're saying it. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I don't think it's on them to necessarily talk about river enhancements beyond the generalities. Just throwing that out.
Yeah, that may or may not be true, because really Riverside Downs, you could take that delineation of that area and just throw it across the river and say, this is all included in Riverside Downs. And sure, it overlaps with the South Platte Working Group and the South Platte Corridor Vision, but to create a community gathering place, that like hits on all cylinders. That kind of.
I'll defer to you,
But
Jocelyn, working that out.
One suggestion might be, I mean, we could include an implementation strategy under that principle to reach out and work with the working group and
Right.
see whether that's something
Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of open the conversation.
Probably.
That's what I was going to offer, because we
Right.
do have a couple other instances in this plan where we have more of a general.
In the corridor section,
To just
yeah.
offer
Yeah.
that it
Yeah.
might be something.
And
to
that's
look
where
into.
I brought,
Yeah.
there's a good spot in the corridor section too, where that's probably more appropriate than right here.
That sounds like a good idea. Okay. Keep going. You got more? That's it? Okay. Frank? Sure.
Okay, so a couple things. Again, not having heard the public engagement, maybe more for discussion amongst us, but there are a couple things. Under principle one, I find it to be a little bit contradiction of terms to say a corridor should be a distinct destination, especially the Bellevue corridor that we're looking at is kind of a mishmash of different things along. It's really a corridor is a place to get from one place to another. It's not always a destination. I think there are destinations within there, and there are viable destinations within there, but a little trouble with the term distinct destination in a corridor. But I do see an opportunity. I think you've started to outline it here with sort of a hierarchy of segments. There's a clear hierarchy between the westernmost and the easternmost segment. And to build on that hierarchy, I think, is important here to create some sort of identity for the corridor. Maybe not so much of a destination, but a corridor identity that's unique within Littleton or within the region. So, you know, it's different in that it ends. I was surprised when I first moved here 20 years ago, driving down Bellevue, and I was like, well, where the heck am I? You know, in Beaumont, like in a residential neighborhood. It has to intentionally ramp down so that you feel like you're not supposed to keep going. But then you've got a CDOT highway, you know, basically at the west end. So I think that hierarchy is important. So somehow in that goal ID1, if we can identify the hierarchy as part of connectivity thing I think is important. You talk about the crossing improvements, and I don't see a specific relation to ADA here, but those crossings really are ADA requirements right now. I mean, you have the diagonal ramps, they should be directional. There's, big crowns. There's if you're driving westbound on Bellevue, that right lane, I always feel like my car's going to roll over, before I get to the federal corner. There's some engineering parts, which obviously aren't part of this plan, but road needs improvement there just to be safer for both pedestrians and vehicles. And then I see Prince as a huge priority connection to get downtown. I think that's the opportunity. And right now, it's to Sherry's point, it's not great. I mean, you get chopped up. You got pork chops on every intersection. You got those free right turns, which aren't very pedestrian friendly. And then once you get to Santa Fe, that's a huge barrier. But that's probably the best one to work on as far as a grade level crossing. I personally don't like grade separated crossings, except in certain locations. Here, I don't think it'll work. So those are my thoughts on the connections. On principles 3 and 4, I think there is kind of an overlapping comment I have on there that really is sort of an aspirational component that there's a great opportunity to make better connections to the neighborhood and at the same time protect those neighborhoods better through a tiering of land uses. Bellevue's a huge opportunity. It's one of the few places in Littleton where you can really do mixed use and pretty high intensity retail commercial development that supports economic development, the tax base and so on, but then also transition to residential neighborhoods that are close by, that walk to, that are changing. Look at Plat 56 or something like that, where there's new development that's going on. And how do you adapt to the changing retail scene, provide redevelopment opportunities for commercial, but also protect the neighborhoods and connect them. So I think that goes to both principle 3 and 2, and it's not a specific comment, it's kind of a general. So that's...
Okay, cool. Maybe an opportunity to define multimodal or have a call out since it's part of the corridor vision. It might be one of those, planning words that's worth highlighting for more of a general audience. Or maybe it's, come into the vernacular already. I don't know. All right. Okay.
I call it plannerese sometimes. There's no definitions anywhere. And we all know what it is, but...
Yeah, but hear a lot about it, but I'll know it when I see it. One thing I did note in the economic development section that I liked is that there's not sort of a really specific, we want to draw this much retail to the corridor, because one thing I observed in the market study was that it was 209,000 square feet over the next, decade or however long the period was. But that's for the entire retail trade area, which goes all the way up into Sheridan, Highway 285, east to Broadway. So that's a 209,000 square feet is not a lot of square foot to share among all of those areas. So it's good that there's no specific, desired square footage in the plan. The Places for People acronym's great. And then I appreciate it does incorporate aspects of neighborhood compatibility. It doesn't say it has to be identical to neighborhoods, but designates that Irving Street and East as sort of a place that's intended to change over time.
I appreciate your changes to the vision statement. It definitely improved from the original. It still feels a little template-y, but not the way it was originally, adding some more of the detail to it. I guess one of my biggest concerns is, and I'm just on page 14 right now, when we talk about creating a distinct identity for Bellevue Avenue, I don't really see that here. I see lots of ideas that make lovely improvements and enhancements, but I don't see a distinct identity being created. One of the, again, just on page 14, looking at the basic principles, I appreciate a lot of the work you did with the supporting the existing businesses and particularly combining that with the economic plan that came later. That was very helpful to have that to read, to come back to here. And personally, I think one of my favorite areas you've done deals with Principle 4. There's a lot of it's been hashed out. You get a really good idea of what you're looking at for the community. I feel like that it's a more complete picture than the other principles have created, in my opinion, of course. Only, hang on, go away. So I'm looking at the first principle, the ID, policy ID 1.1, the branding. I feel there's a lot of nebula. It's kind of nebulous. I mean, the ideas are good, but you say distinctive urban design elements. What does that really mean? It just feels a little nebulous there. I'm just reading my notes, excuse me. That's pretty much what it is. It's hard when your computer has everything locked up and you can't figure, and it doesn't say it right out like you can when you write on it, so it just takes me a second to click on them and see. I like the idea where you talk about the gateways and the mediums, and that is a way to create some distinct identity and artwork and that sort of stuff, perhaps the community dissolving a little more into. That really does do that. A lot of your ideas on the mobility are, this is an area that's much more measurable than in the other areas, and I really appreciate that. It's like when you read this and you see your ideas, you could see that happening in community and say, yes, this principle is occurring. I appreciate how much more measurable that is. Moving on to the next principle, 3, protecting and reinvesting in the border neighborhood. My concern is again, I've talked about the idea of character. It's one of those words we just use, but we don't define. We talk about, here it's good you have respecting established setbacks, the building, the heights, the massing, the scale. That's really good because that's something specific where you're including in there. But my concern is when you say respect the character of the neighborhood, we have that in other plans, and I've seen where you have to take into account the character of the neighboring buildings, and nonetheless will have a 3-story property filling this right next to a small, tiny single cottage, and that's not respecting the character. And so my concern is that's what's being missed here. We see that in other areas in our community, so that's a big concern of mine with this.
Talk about that area just for a little bit more. A couple thoughts. So one is, I think part of it is, we've got the background description of the neighborhoods. I think we've tried to spell out some of the unique characteristics with the corridor. I think one of the challenges with a corridor like this, as you guys know, is, a lot of it isn't going to change. And so what can we control and what can the city encourage, as it occurs over time? And so we've tried to focus more detail on those areas where, like Columbine Square, where we know that there are specific transitions that need to happen. What does that need to be? What's the mix of housing types you want to see? Kind of more of those details. So we've put a lot more energy into those locations. I think the general urban design aspects, those are really only going to happen when you do get more development. And so we've tried to provide, some things to draw from there. But I think there's, the wayfinding and all those other things are kind of the more easily implemented ideas that can kind of create an obvious change for the neighborhood and something that's, people can see. And, I think there's been positive response to the new signage along the Greenway. And so, those are smaller things that are that you can do that you're going to see change more quickly. But we've tried to balance kind of the, we can't change that until someone comes in and says they want to do a project. And if they do, here's some guidance related to that. But, I think we haven't gone in with the assumption that we can physically change the entire
Not looking to that.
core. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that wasn't
the clarification. So I'll explain. We have, Littleton Village right next to Oak Brook, and the only thing it says in the neighborhood plan for Oak Brook is in the south area there is to keeping with the character of the neighbors. Well, in Oak Brook being right next to Littleton Village, that you've got single-family homes right across the street now from 3-story apartments. That's not in keeping with the character. These are my concerns. They're pretty basic in the sense that, that transition there it's not a transition. So all I'm concerned with is making sure that you don't have that kind of disruption where you have a really specific type of community. Something different can sure be built next to it, but there has to be a better transition, something in keeping with that. That's my biggest concern, and I see that happening in other areas, particularly downtown. Again, small little cottages. Next thing you know, you have a 3-story lot-filling building next to it. And those things are my concern, and I'm not sure that's really protected here. I do, and later on when you do talk about more in some of the areas where you get really specific, I don't necessarily see that as being enough too. Again, you're on principle 4 with the businesses. Appreciate a lot of the work that you did there. Only a small, slight suggestion. I always like to start with the, would be the R2, is supporting the existing building, the existing businesses first. I don't know. I always like to put the existing first over the new. It's really simple, silly. Creating the more gathering places. I loved what John had to say about creating a place on the river like that. I appreciate a lot of the work that you've done on that area there for improving the river area. Thank you.
Okay. Please.
We'll start out Principle 1, create a distinctive identity for Bellevue Avenue. I have down here my impression of the identity of the street itself is an efficient expressway with little or no interest, an artery to get to home or to a store, period. So there's not much going on there. West of Federal, Bellevue does take on an identity. That identity, I feel, needs to be pushed towards the east, whether it be landscaping. I'm pushing for center median, let's see, probably west of Santa Fe, next block over. But at any rate, that's important to me. Maybe this is going to be a pessimistic statement here, but every town has a Bellevue, a street with just fast-moving cars, all different kinds of architectures, a plethora of different signage, not real attractive. What are our chances to control, to change everything on Bellevue? I think you said there's only so much you can do. There's existing zoning usage by right, different styles. What creates identity for a street like Bellevue? A well-defined landscaping plan, homogeneous building styles, homogeneous signage, buildings pushed to the street, uniform building locations, putting parking in front of buildings. It does create an identity, but it's not a really nice identity. Something of a human scale. A human scale in New York would be different from a human scale on Bellevue. So, anyway, there's limited amount that we can do, and that I think that's what the study is implying here. Let's see. Somebody mentioned the ADA. I think we covered that further in. There's a statement about ADA. Yep. On page 18, policy R-1.2, connection between the study area and Union Avenue is a long-term strategy. I can't figure out where Union Avenue is. So.
It's the north side of the Inglewood connection.
Oh, it's an Inglewood.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
couldn't find it
note that.
on the map in this booklet. Principle 5. You talk about active uses, concentration uses, plazas, etc. And I wrote down here, and Columbine, very important to me, and I think very important to the future development of that site, and very important to the developer of that site. But an outdoor gathering space, you do mention in the future fountains and other amenities for redevelopment areas. So you picked that up nicely. Those are my general comments.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought I like the corridor vision. I think it flows well. By the way, I think, I don't think this is anything out of the ordinary necessarily for how you guys maybe see these things, but, we appreciate the sausage making, and there's you guys did a lot of nice work in putting this together. I think I agree with Mark. I mean, this thing is it flows very well, it reads very well, there's some content we're trying to provide feedback on, but I really also appreciated you guys honoring the timeline, because these things can get into a feedback loop where they never get done, but you guys have been really strong in terms of keeping to the timeline, which I think is excellent. So I just wanted to say that. On principle 1, I agree with Craig. I have often gone to, told my wife, hey, I've got to run to Home Depot. Or why don't we go to get a tasty burger at Freddy's Frozen Custard, which is in fact a shameless merchant plug. But I don't, in living here for 20-some years, I've never said, hey, let's go shop Bellevue. It just doesn't exist.
Sure.
So, the streets of Bellevue thing, you got to think through that, because I just don't see that as actually being a viable attribute. The wayfinding, no issue with that necessarily, but it does presuppose some of the other things that were said about, hey, you got to address, maybe you shrink the street a little bit. Maybe, if you want to make it more pedestrian friendly, then the wayfinding becomes certainly plausible. And in particular, the wayfinding to get to the river accesses and the trail accesses, it would be top of mind share, I think. I like the stuff on Principle 2, the mobility pieces. Principle 3, one thing I was going to mention to you that hasn't come up is NR-1.3. Arapahoe Hills National Historic District encouraged the designation of Arapahoe Hills as a Littleton Historic District. You might want to clarify that just a smidge. The average individual, myself included, I had to make a quick outreach to verify, because I knew there was an historic district involved, and Bill Hopping, who had been doing this for years, pointed out that it was a national registry item, and it's got some guidelines for Littleton, but it's not a Littleton Historic District a la Loughton Street. The average individual and or developer probably isn't going to know the difference.
Sure.
On 4, yeah, I agree. The Union Avenue thing, if you want to reference Union, you got to put it on the map. I knew where it was, but I spent a little bit of time trying to figure out if it was on the map. And then the north-south connectivity, I just kind of assumed that was federal already, but if you really think Union is something that could connect through, so be it. One thing that I actually thought was interesting on R1.1 and R2.1, I don't know if you want to call this out, the city of Lakewood did a business improvement district on Colfax Avenue in the vicinity of Wadsworth. That area looks not at all dissimilar from Bellevue, at Federal-ish. It's a little less, Watts and Colfax is a little more intense, and there's more traffic and so forth and so on, but the physical structure is not ridiculously dissimilar. They threw a business improvement district in there, the stores and so forth, the retailers are collecting the incremental revenue, and then they put in an art walk kind of thing. I'm not saying we would do that here, but if you want to talk about something specific with respect to what Bellevue could theoretically be, I think that kind of a model starts looking interesting. Now, you want to talk about the devil in the details, that, quite clearly isn't something that's going to happen tomorrow. But that's a tangible, structural kind of thing that theoretically you could say, hey, why don't we look at something like this?
They've also got some signage work that they did at that intersection and such.
Yeah. No, I thought it was an interesting model. I mean, it hasn't been seamless, but I think it's improved an area that literally, there were a lot of similarities between what was there and what we have now. In fact, in some respects, Bellevue at Federal and that whole corridor is a little more vibrant than Colfax and Wadsworth was. It's probably flipped a little bit at this point based on what I can tell. The vacant and underperformed spaces, again, I mean, that's the secret sauce right there. I mean, you got a bunch of shopping areas. The one you called out, that's pretty much to the northwest corner of Prince and San Miguel, is that Centennial or whatever. Yeah, I mean, some of these things, they're 70s construction, they're 70s layout and so forth and so on. They need to be refreshed. It's not going to happen overnight because we're probably on the tail end of this particular cycle, but at the next cycle it would be interesting if some of these spaces could be teed up for some level of mixed-use redevelopment that could be accommodated with respect to the density and traffic flow issues and intensity issues that have been mentioned. I know they've got the condos going in at Prince across the street now, north of Bellevue, Prince, and next to the Walgreens up there.
Plat 56. Plat 56. It's called Plat 56.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, thank you. But, so that type of thing starts looking interesting in terms of restaurant, entertainment, I don't know. There's a lot of models for that are different than sort of what kind of is there that would be more interesting for the neighborhood, might draw some people in, would be more interesting for the community as far as sales tax, revenue generation, so forth and so on. All right, on to chapter 4, opportunity.
Bruce, before we move on, I just wanted a clarification page. It's principle 2, and it's policy 2-2.3, regional bike facilities. I don't really understand what that means. What is a bike facility? Is it a warehouse for bikes? Is it?
Well, it sounds like it might be the Mary Carter, but Jocelyn, you want to explain that, or you guys want to?
Yeah, it's generally all-encompassing, so it can mean like a bike connection, a bike path. Facilities doesn't necessarily mean a building.
Right, but
to clarify,
to a layperson, that's very
yes,
confusing.
no, that's a very good point.
Okay.
Bike plan, I believe, actually uses that as a term of art, so that's where that comes from, and Dr. Cog does as well in terms of the regional bike network. So maybe we can try to figure out a better way to say that, but that is what they call it. So, but we can clarify that.
Okay.
Could be infrastructure or something, I don't know.
Or even network.
Yeah, network's good.
Even
That's way better. Okay, thank you.
Any other final thoughts on chapter 3? And when we go back this way?
Could we break it up into just, everybody talks about Columbine Square, then moves on to the next one, rather than every person going through every single one in one shot?
We can absolutely do that. We don't even need a reason.
Okay. All right. Okay.
All right, then. Fine. Why don't you start with Columbine Square?
There we go. Okay. Well, I'll say it again publicly. The main reason we're doing the corridor study is because of opportunity area number one, Columbine Square. Let's be honest about it. That's number one and number two in importance. The other areas are important as well. Let's see. I like the integration of O'Toole's. That brought up all kinds of visions of sugar plums dancing in my head. of integrating O'Toole's with Columbine Square. Right now they're at odds. They erect a spike fence. They do. They're at odds. They're at war. It seems constantly. Good God, come to an agreement, and it can be an integration of similar uses, small stores that complement O'Toole's, that complement what else is going on in Columbine Square, housing, some small retail opportunities along Federal. Wonderful possibilities there if only somebody has some vision and a few bucks. And by the way, they'll make more money if they have a vision and put in a few bucks in the beginning.
They have a lot of landscaping.
And so what's that?
They have a lot of landscaping there.
I think you would get
like that.
I think you would get, plazas. That could, you were questioning Bellevue being a destination or what was the word they used in the last chapter? But this could be a destination place, not just a place to run into on your way home. So if there's some editorial comment. In the infill, in the blue box here, infill development guidelines, page 25, you talk about how the bullet is housing. Encourage a range of housing types, such as patio homes, duplexes, and townhomes. To me, that's not quite reality here. I see, I know what the neighbors will say, but to make this a viable project, there's going to have to be some taller buildings, maybe in the center, away from the residential areas, perhaps 3 to 4 stories. That to me is an economic reality of Columbine Square. The public and the rest of the Planning Commission might disagree. That's my comments.
Robin?
Reversing tides, okay. I guess I was curious, so Columbine Square, most of this that focuses on is housing. That kind of surprised me. I mean, it is B2, which means, of course, it can have the 50% housing, but it just seemed the focus was on housing.
So based on discussions, input from the retail study, discussions with the developer, I think the realization was this is not going to redevelop as a retail center in its former life. It's not going to be the same. And that housing was going to be a really key part of that, and retail would be secondary. And since the concern from the residents was primarily focused on housing, I think that's what you're seeing a lot of is, mix and transitions and all of those things, kind of thinking about being sensitive to the adjacent neighborhoods. We also talk about the connections through the site and some of those other things that, we heard from the community. Wouldn't it be great if I could ride my bike from here to there? And so we're trying to capture all of those things, but I think it is pretty intentional that this isn't, focused primarily on retail, but maybe we've gone too far on the housing end potentially in terms of that focus. And
well, I just think as a
that.
B2, it's a potential 50-50, but this makes it, and when I look down at some of the pictures, it just makes it look, it's like it takes out that 50-50. And I was a little concerned with some of the pictures because the intensity, and again, I know that was a big concern with the community about being too intense. How is this going to affect the traffic? When I look at that, I get the concerns from what the community was saying there too. So I agree with Mark on the essence of integrating, like O'Toole's. I mean, O'Toole's is a huge hotspot in Littleton. Who doesn't love to go to O'Toole's just to go to O'Toole's? But I'm concerned with the too much focus on housing and the intensity of it. The neighboring communities have a lot more green to them. This is just so developed compared to even some of the apartment areas you see where there's a lot more green space around it and that. So those are my concerns with that.
So just in terms of imagery, I want to make sure we understand what you're looking for. I mean, it sounds like more, the examples that are shown have common open space and some of the other types of concepts that, we had talked about and kind of what the developer was looking for. Are you talking about more park space? What are you envisioning based on what you've kind of talked about?
So when I look at, and I'll just look at the one picture that's more large and seeds, that's on page 26, and it's the bottom left corner. That's an intense area. Yes, there's green space, but not, you're surrounded, you've got a lot of single-family homes. They have a bit more yard to them. It's a little more spread out. Even when you look at the apartments that are on the southern portion of that, they still are more spread out. They have more green in between them, whereas here it's like everything's jammed together. There's a little green here, there's a little green here, there's a little green there. Does that help? Does that explain a little better what I'm saying or no?
So, yeah.
I mean, this is a suburban area. This makes me start thinking more like a Denver than a Littleton.
Sure.
The way it's jammed together.
Jason?
Sure. One thing that I appreciate is that it does talk about the need for a transition from the residential area, and that it emphasizes that we need a mix of housing options in this. Because the takeaway I got from the market study is that with 209,000 square feet of retail to split up between a 2-mile radius, there's not enough housing to support retail and additional retail in this corridor. So the housing's got to be there if we want retail. And as far as intensity, looking at the same picture, I'm seeing a really nicely connected green space corridor that winds its way through that neighborhood. I'm seeing some single-family homes that are much more intense, I'll grant you that, but that also reflects how single-family homes are built today. If you go to newly developing neighborhoods, they build to the setback. People don't want the huge yard. You don't see a 9,000 square foot lot with a 900 square foot house on it anymore. And just, as the transition goes, you've probably got an R3 zoning west of there with a 30-foot height limit. Most of those houses, could be 2 stories. So going from 2 stories to 3 stories could be seen as a decent transition as you move into that former site. Also, the integration with O'Toole's was something that I read and was pleasantly surprised by. That was, it's like, that's a wonderful idea. Someone can integrate that with the neighborhood. They can walk to O'Toole's and bring the plants back for their rooftop garden.
Well, why not have rooftop gardens on some of the residential portions stepped up? Wouldn't that be marvelous, overlooking O'Toole's? My God.
Well, and keep in mind that it sounds like the conversations with O'Toole's haven't gone swimmingly.
But we
want to caveat that, but we didn't want to
And-
lose the idea, should that change.
Yeah, and the other thing I also appreciate is that the plan isn't, this is an aspirational document, so it doesn't necessarily have to follow the current zoning for the site.
Anything else? Greg?
Yeah, I'm going to pick on one of these because I think it's just a really cool opportunity area. I don't know much about the Columbine Square because I'm just getting back up to speed. I do love the Highlands Garden Village example myself. I think it's a good one. And it's a project. I wanted to talk about opportunity area number 4, which is the Arapahoe Center.
I think we're going to do sort of we're going to do Columbine
Oh, I
first.
see. Okay, well then I'll pass on that.
Okay, we'll get there.
Okay, gotcha. I thought we were going principle by principle.
Yeah, no worries. Okay.
So the opportunity area, that's a good description, but the Columbine Square Shopping Center is a subset of that area, and it's kind of, as opposed to Tenniel Square, which is kind of just the whole area. It'd be nice to have a shading or something to show in here, particularly on this one, maybe earlier in the plan throughout, to show where that property delineation is, so that the reader knows, okay, that's Columbine Square ownership. There's the bank parcel, that's not within there. I don't know if it is or not. O'Toole's apparently is not in there, or is the city building. So I think that's my
It's a good idea.
Just a couple comments. I have kind of a concern about the calling out of O'Toole's. I don't know the history of that. I know O'Toole's very well, but it just seems, I question whether that's an appropriate thing to be pulling out in O'Toole's right here and writing about. I don't know. I'll leave that up to you all. It just seems a bit odd calling out specific ownership property and not others.
You know, it was called out primarily, but that was a big deal for the community in terms of something they really valued in the corridor. So I think people like the idea of not, you know, if anything changes here, we want to make sure that that's part of the conversation. So it's meant to be sort of an inclusive thing versus a singling them out.
I think the other piece of that too is just the functionality of the areas. They're intertwined because, as you know, when you go to a busy Saturday O'Toole's, they are parking everywhere. So it has to be part of the conversation just from the future, how does this all kind of work together and access and those type of things. Sure, I think that was the other concern from the community. We heard a lot of about make sure you're respecting that and helping continue that conversation and recognizing the importance of all of these things needing to be.
Maybe it's just the way it's written, because I think if you were just anybody reading this, like I am, except I actually know this area, it doesn't make a lot of sense, frankly. It's just kind of, you had to be there and understand why this little paragraph was put in this plan. Okay, so I guess some better way to tie that into why are you highlighting that specific property versus all the others. And I just agree on the business use that I think for the property is under-emphasized here. And I don't think we should assume that, you know, this site is not appropriate for some retail or something. Perhaps that's true. There's plenty of retail along there, or another business use, whether it's some kind of low-level office. So I'm agreeing about, you know, this section on Columbine's primarily geared toward that whole property being redeveloped residential.
Well, one clarification though, I think on page 25, top left on the blue box, the mix of uses, I think we do talk about that commercial component and kind of where that would be concentrated.
Right. I agree, but it doesn't tie back to all the written.
Okay.
The box says that, but the other highlights do not say any. They're all housing oriented.
Pictures say another story, you notice that. So there's a little bias, a little bent towards, you're pushing residential, it seems here,
right,
versus the retail portion.
So
get another commercial, how about some, what commercial might look like on Bellevue, or I'm sorry, Federal.
well, and this may be a case where the order matters too. I think on the bullets under the short-term opportunities, why don't we bump up the neighborhood serving uses? I mean, that was, you know, the restaurants and retail, that was just to make that more prominent too. But we can definitely incorporate some different images as well. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay, well, yeah, most of the stuff that's been mentioned, I just actually sitting here noticed a typo.
I saw a type. I saw one type. Same one.
24 under urban renewal, it says use. Last line, their council chooses to use ND and the community supports. So that should be the end. I don't know if it's, I mean, yes, technically, this was the only area that council a couple years ago left as an urban renewal area. I'll defer to you guys, and Jocelyn, you may want to weigh into this. I'm not entirely sure there's a lot of added value in calling out urban renewal for this. It's either going to happen or it won't. If it happens, it's going to be, you know, curb gutter kind of stuff for the developer in exchange for something. It's not really something that anybody else is going to deal with because it only applies to it only applies to this parcel. But they're going to deal with it when they get to the redevelopment of it, one way or the other. Either they'll get it or they won't get it.
Centennial Plaza also is part of the urban renewal, that little chunk.
Yeah, well, okay, that's fair. Yeah, you're correct.
The context context there too, I mean, from the perspective of Matt Prosser, who worked on the retail study, is that they're going to need that, and that, having the plan call that out and reinforce the importance of that in terms of addressing some of the sewer issues and that sort of thing. So it was a specific statement to kind of reinforce that that's an important tool that they would need to really make this happen.
Yeah, no, I understand the background on all of that. It's just, that's fine. I don't have a problem. Just go ahead. You want to make your additional comments?
Also, often being accused of carrying around the zoning code regulation all the time.
In fact, you are doing.
Yes, in fact, I'm doing. Keep in mind that Columbine Square is B2 zoning, which is the same zoning as the Grove. So it's a fairly heavy-duty, intensive piece of property, used by right, setbacks, no height limit, minimal setbacks for some landscaping, a 2-to-1 floor area ratio. So that's heavy-duty for Littleton. Jason, you did mention a very interesting comment. It's R2 to the west of Columbine, 30-foot height limit. So theoretically, in the future, every house there could be scraped and popped or popped to 2-story.
I don't know if this is necessary for the bigger discussion, but most likely, when we have these larger single-owned properties, what we generally see today in Littleton, due to the antiquatedness of our zoning code, is most of those come in to create their own zoning through a PD. So that is most likely the scenario for Columbine for this property. If they are planning to do something in the near term. As you guys know, we're going to do the vision, update the comprehensive plan by the end of next year, and then hopefully look at zoning, but that's still a couple of years out. So if they wait till after that, then maybe it's, whatever that zoning looks like at that time, but it's probably most likely that they would come in and rezone that to a planned development. So it's less likely that it would be B2.
Okay. Opportunity area number 2, Tenniel Square. Sherry, any comments on this bad boy?
I don't at the moment.
Okay, John? Greg?
Needs to be redeveloped.
Yeah.
That's all I can say.
Not very dry.
I don't think the neighbors think that. They like the pizza place. They could keep talking about this. Jason, go ahead. No, seriously, you have any other comments?
No, I didn't.
I think, the new ownership, hopefully, bullet point, enhance the visual appeal and functionality of the center. That's my way out of King Supers. I'm sick of the potholes in the parking lot.
Right.
You're deadly.
How many alignments do you need on your car?
No comments.
Marcus?
Just the short-term opportunities, the marketing, it's interesting. The vision in that section is very similar to Mineral Light Rail site. It's quite interesting.
Okay. All right.
We're picking up typos. I found one.
Oh, good.
Under site description, King Supers.
Say that again.
She found it.
On that same page, there is a typo in key issues
Supers?
due to the age and date. Here's a configuration. See that one?
Got the Kings, so there's another.
It's a date, yes, key issues, first bullet point.
Top right.
Due to the 0B. That's the only one I saw.
I thought that was a math term, the 0th.
What's it?
Okay. Riverside Downs. Go ahead.
Let's see. Nothing really. Again, the marketing was very similar to Mineral Light Rail Station as far as its location near the river.
Just one comment comment about under the long-term considerations about the infill development. I'm a little concerned about too much infill in the sense that, there's a lot of neighborhoods now or communities where we're getting not enough parking, and I don't want to see this like go overboard to the other side. When you're on the one side, where the Starbucks is, man, that is a pain to go through, and it makes you want to avoid that area. I don't want to see that happen to there. We go through cycles, and I'm concerned that, if we make too much change there, we go through another cycle, and suddenly we wish we had the parking there again. Just balance of that.
Should we add a note there about parking or change that statement? Any other feedback on that one?
I'm not exactly sure how to say that. I'm perhaps Dennis or Jocelyn would, but right now, some things that are underutilized. And in other places you talked about, temporary things. And I thought that would be ideal in something like this because of the situation right now. Some temporary types of things might be very feasible or viable. But just to look to the future and not be too focused in the sense that, we're not using it now, but not looking to the future.
Sure.
Appreciate that.
I think the comment on the parking may be finding a better balance of parking with the uses, because right now it's not a balance. Like you said,
It's
over at
very
Starbucks, everybody wants to be there and there's no parking. And then at the other end down by Pedal, if you go past there, nobody ever parks there, but there's nothing there really to do, and it could be more park.
It's an interesting center because I've gone to the Pint Room a lot, and massage therapy place there, and that Starbucks parking lot where the massage therapy and Jimmy John's is frequently full. But the entire shopping center is walkable if you're willing to walk more than 100 feet from your car to the retail.
Maybe, and you know what, maybe another one, I'm just thinking about it too, maybe it's about internal wayfinding, right? Once you're in there. Honestly, I don't really understand how to get around, quite frankly, just as a person going there, even. I don't really recognize, there are some cool connections to the river, unless you're at the Pint Room or one of the restaurants, but somehow just a better awareness about where I could park versus,
it has a good layout in terms of pedestrian connectivity through the center. It's just most people don't utilize that southern lot by 24-hour fitness and pedal.
Maybe you could just change that recommendation to utilize the area for outdoor gatherings instead of the excess parking, because I think somewhere in the plan it talked about trying to utilize better the land along the river for gathering, public gathering spaces.
There is a small little amphitheater they put in a couple of years ago, right down there, sort of to the northeast of Petal.
Is it used for?
You just don't know.
I don't know. There was when they put it in, there was talk of having concerts, small concerts and stuff like that, and I couldn't say whether they actually do that or not, but I know it's there.
It's really well done, too.
Yeah, it's nice. Yeah. It's a good template, for what other areas might be.
But maybe make that more of an opportunity, right? Focus around that or something.
Craig or Jason, or John, did you guys have more?
Yeah, I have it.
Go ahead.
So similar to Columbine Square, where the opportunity area includes more than just the parcel that's under primary. This, I would like to see the opportunity area go across the river. And the reason why is that opportunity area, by expanding, going across the river, it will enhance community thinking, perception of the river corridor as a community asset to be incorporated into planning decisions, rather than just, okay, that's the river and we stop right here. But really, that whole Riverside Downs, it's reflected in the name of the facility that's been built there, and also a big focus of the facility is to try to incorporate it in with that little section of the river right there.
So how far would you go, John, just to the other bank of the river?
Yeah, I'd go across the bike path on the other side, and then just, you could have an enhancement showing that the Riverside Downs is actually where that boundary is, but the boundary, that opportunity area goes across the river. And let's look at the river and how that river integrates in with that parcel and my other little idea discussed.
So would you then keep, so looking on page, the next page.
30.
Yeah, would you keep area 7 and just kind of, so basically, that would still remain? We would just expand the Riverside Down ones to the east more? I think we could do.
Which page are you talking about?
So,
This,
yeah, so on.
What do you
so
Oh,
this is
yeah.
basically, right,
Yeah.
the area that you're talking about.
30.
All of that, or just, here's a better picture to see. So it basically is this, is 7.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I guess it would go up to where 7 stops, so they'd kind of be right adjacent to each other.
Okay.
So basically to the path.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, I think
Yeah.
that works.
I think that's kind of like a psychological change, too.
Yeah,
How
that's
you-
great.
It's like, okay, that's interesting. We could think about how we integrate this area as well.
Okay.
I think I would build off of that. I really agree with what John's saying, and incorporate Prince Street and that loop, that edge in there. And as I mentioned, the connection thing, I was thinking Prince is really the primary opportunity to connect the Bellevue corridor to downtown Littleton. I don't think it's Santa Fe. Or I'm sorry, it's not Bellevue itself. We're across the Santa Fe. And by encompassing that, I think it does get into the public realm, I'd call it, beyond the development itself, that kind of ties that together and even incorporates the bridge. I mean, that bridge across the river there is a huge pedestrian bike opportunity there.
I think those two bridges also help set the character of the red brick and the lighting and everything else. We see a lot of it.
Yeah, but I mean, the problem with them is you can't see the river. I mean, you drive over the bridge, you can't see the river. You know, if you want to accent, if you want the river to be the focal point of what's going on, you've got to have visibility to it. So that would be a concern. The other thing you might want to do, at least as far as Area 3 is concerned, is South Suburban won't, for a variety of reasons having to do with the master plan, they won't put a lot of signage on the trail. Conversely, there ought to be some wayfinding that says, you know, this way to the South Platte River or the Mary Carter Greenway or whatever, because, I mean, if you're up, you either have to know where you're going, or if you want to get down there, you literally are going to have to walk in a store and find somebody and ask them, how do I get down to the river? Kind of thing. So there ought to be some way, you know, I think the physical access points exist, but nobody, unless you know what you're doing, nobody knows they're there.
On page 15, there's a photo of the signs they have along the trail. They don't have those above, so maybe they have something similar above.
Yeah, but isn't that down further? Where is that?
That one's just south of Bellevue.
It's where?
Just south of Bellevue on the trail.
Oh, okay, Bellevue overpass. Okay, well, actually, I hadn't seen that. Yeah, but something up above that would
Mimic that, I think.
Yeah, and you know.
It's good information. And
Yeah, there you go.
They have it on both sides of the trail and point to the store,
Okay.
the restaurants, the bike path, all that kind of
Well, I
stuff.
stand corrected then. That's actually, yeah, I have not ridden up that way in a while and didn't know it was there. And so, yeah, I was ignorant and conveying weak information.
But they don't have them up above. So.
Yeah.
A good example of what you were talking about is seeing the river from a bridge. Like Fifth Street, the opportunity would be, if you've seen the in Golden, the one that goes across Clear Creek, I think it's Washington Street.
Yeah.
That's a great bridge.
Yeah, I think that the views could be, well, not right now because there's no water, but normally if there were like water, the views were really good once you're going over Prince Street. But I mean, you can't see the water unless you do one of these when you're driving by.
Unless you're walking, you should be walking, not driving.
Yeah, well. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's see. Any comments? Where are we then? We did Riverside. We did. All right, so now we're at. Arapahoe Center and Centennial Plaza. And go ahead.
Well, the only comment I have is mixes of uses incorporated in the blue box. Incorporate a mix of ground floor neighborhood serving retail and multi-family residential. I'm going for that narrow site. I'm going, what the hey? I don't know where that came from. I don't see residential in that narrow strip.
Well, I think the thought was it's going to be what it is probably for quite some time.
Yeah.
But if it were to redevelop, that likely it would have to be vertical mixed use of some sort. Just that it would probably fill more of that site than it does today.
Well, it's, I agree. There's a lot of areas in Littleton that now are commercial that are obviously in the future going to be residential. Old strip centers. This spot I could see. It's not that good looking, but it's chock full of neighborhood services. 100%. I could see that staying commercial. It was just a thought that again, it's multifamily. Hello. I don't know where that came from. I wouldn't include it for my report.
So should we just, in terms of future redevelopment opportunities then, would you just leave it as, you wouldn't specify basically, and see what happens? Is that?
It could happen. It's a possibility.
I'm on the lines of what you're saying here. That to me looks like, where'd that come from? It seems totally out of character for that whole neighborhood surrounding it. From what I've heard from people who live there, they really utilize the area there, though I believe Andrew said it all depends on how good the pizza place is. I do remember him saying that.
Yeah, they love the pizza place.
So question, I guess, does it make sense to have, knowing that that's probably going to stay there for quite some time, if something happens down the road, do you want to have, if we drop number one, the mix of uses, and we just kind of keep the other kind of considerations, is that worthwhile, or to kind of carry those forward, or not? Should we take that out?
I would drop the mixed use.
Or just drop the mixed use. Okay.
But that's one person's view. I don't know. Whatever else.
Thoughts on that?
I agree with you. I agree with that.
Well, it's only two of
a few others.
The seven of us here.
I mean, it could if somehow underground parking were economically feasible.
Sure.
It seems out of place.
Yeah, it's a tough site. And I think the plan acknowledges that. But it has a good pizza place.
It's a great pizza. Most importantly.
Again, shameless plug.
No name yet, though.
Making me hungry.
Craig, you got anything?
Yeah, Arapahoe Center is the one that I wanted to kind of focus on more for a short-term opportunity. Long-term, it is what it's going to be, but I just wonder if there's something that could be put in this Carter plan about that. I don't know the backstory about how much the neighborhood loves it. It sounds like and the city's doing things to help improve it now, but to me it looks like a sea of asphalt. No sidewalks, no landscape, no opportunities for like outdoor seating for little cafes or restaurants, and it seems like parking demand is probably driving that, right? Even with all the pavement there, it's probably difficult to find parking spots. So what if the transportation Carter plan had something about reducing the parking on-site and maybe putting some on-street parking there at the perimeter roadways? One is Lowell right now. There's no parking allowed on the street. I don't think there may be a bike lane or not. And then that diagonal road, I'm not sure what that's called, but the one that cuts across there, could that have on-street parking that would help relieve the parking demand from on-street, so you could actually reduce the amount of parking, so you could actually have some, it seems like there's something else the city could do to help that center thrive and make it nicer, a better user experience that could be part of this. I support the efforts that are going on there now, but it just seems like maybe something else about access and parking. It's too small to warrant a parking structure. I don't know, just some thoughts.
Okay, cool, good. Jason?
John. That's Jason.
I'm sorry. I apologize. Well, did you have any more comments?
Recover it. Hey, you.
You, honey. Sherry.
No, just a typo.
Oh, okay.
Key issues, connectivity, centers lacks. That's it. I have no comment about
Okay.
whatever.
And I agree with the extrication of multifamily residential. It just doesn't fit there. Anybody have anything on page 30?
Oh, can we just back up a second?
Yeah.
The hearing isn't great. Craig, are you advocating for Centennial Plaza maybe having a new number 1 or in the blue box that talks about, adding some landscaping to this doggone thing?
Yeah.
That would be, replace one bullet. That's not the most important.
I think it's in there, but it was in the long term. I was thinking it should be in the short term.
Right. And as you say, it would improve the center and the looks and probably improve the profits, so life's good.
Without reducing the parking that's available. So how do you do that?
Yeah, that's great. Look, cars, okay, it's very small cars.
Okay, I think if you're okay with handling chapter 5 just in its entirety, if anyone has any comments regarding corridor enhancements and mass, why don't we attend to those? You want to go first, Sherry?
I need to pass right now.
Okay, then to John. Same. Craig?
Let me get to it, so.
Yeah.
Well, I have some suggestions while you're looking that up based on what you guys were just talking about, I can't remember who was saying it, but I heard a conversation about the bridge that goes over Bellevue. Maybe there's at least a recognition of that somehow in this section. We should talk about that. The other piece was the importance of Prince as a connection to downtown, and maybe again, it's on the map, maybe it's more in the, that might be another thing to look at. Sure. And then another important thing that I think we able to see is that trailhead parking. I think that's important, at least on this map, because that could also be an important piece in the future. I don't know exactly, but that is really, you don't even see it at all.
And it's access only from eastbound. You can't go, it's there.
But I think it's an important element
It is
for the
there.
future. So, with what John was saying about that connection through that stretch of the river.
Inside the bridge.
So anyway, those are just some of the things I thought of as you guys were.
Yeah.
So in identifying the
So right before you
bridges,
get
are we
back,
suggesting specific improvements to those, or just calling those out as kind of, I mean, they really are kind of gateways to the corridor in
Yeah,
some ways.
I think it's more that than.
Well, I think it's getting rid of the brick and making an opening up the grading so you can actually view the river.
Yeah, Andrew brought that up, right? He thought the brick was important, but yeah, if there was a way to create little arches or something.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know how you re-engineer or redesign it. Yeah, maybe you keep some of the brick, but you put enough space in there so somebody can actually see
The water.
Well, I think as what she was saying too, as like we were talking about as the gateway, that
Yeah,
might be an
right.
opportunity to create that more distinct area just with that feature, right?
Okay, Craig, you got,
Yeah, I think on the intersection, I'm looking at the map on page
33 probably is it?
Yeah. And we circled the Santa Fe intersection with Prince as I know it's going to be in the Santa Fe corridor plan as well, but I think that kind of doubles the importance of addressing that. And plus that little loop intersection that, connects to the frontage marginal road there makes it especially challenging to cross. On we were talking about medians, and I mentioned before the idea of a hierarchy from Santa Fe to Beaumar. I agree that there should be medians, at least in the section from Prince to Lowell West. There already are medians, and they're pretty nice. So I think the median for traffic control and visual enhancement is really important. It also can provide a refuge at the crosswalks. They're extended, right? Street trees, detached sidewalks. I think that's all said in here. I think minimum sidewalks. I think even the sidewalks probably should be hierarchical in that they're 5 feet as you approach Beaumar, but they could be wider. They could be as you get close to Santa Fe. Jason?
One suggestion might be to add an intersection improvements logo at Prince and Santa Fe. I think it's actually discussed in the text that there's a project for intersection improvements. And I've got to say, having ridden my bike in that intersection, it's nice to see that they're improving the striping on Prince because it's a little awkward, the transitions in that area.
A little scary when you're westbound.
Yeah.
It is.
It's like, how do I get off this road?
It's somewhere that there's more accidents at that particular crossing, Prince and Santa Fe, than just about anywhere in Littleton.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting.
To echo some of the comments about the...
It's where people want to be, but it's not friendly for them.
Mark?
Well, let's see. I just comment about Section 7 there, the piece that's along the river on the east side. Not to step on anybody's property rights, but what a golden opportunity for the future to have, especially on the west end of that triangular piece, to have some river-related functions there versus what was all along the corridor from the good old days. Nice opportunity. Other than that, number 8 is a possibility, but way down the road probably. A use that belongs somewhere else.
Do you have anything else on, how about chapter 5 as well?
Oh, we doing both of them? I thought we were still on the
No, it's sort of,
5 to 9 here.
Actually, I think we, pretty much. That's okay.
I'm way behind the curve here. Okay.
We're sort of moving all around.
Wow,
a bit,
going fast
going
here.
around the horn.
Well, so then I do agree with the center median. To me is important between Prince and Lowell. A long time ago, the Planning Commission, we looked at a study. It showed various perspectives about having a corridor like Bellevue. Then you add a center median. Then you add the center median with some trees, and the effect was electric. It just slowed things down. It gave the corridor in the sample some identity, some character. There was also, in the same study, we looked at if you end up doing a lot of landscaping either side, and that becomes a problem with the retailers showing their goods and showing their signage, getting people to come in. but the opportunity, if you can work it out with CDOT, that's obviously a problem, is a center median wide enough to do some trees to calm that raceway down Bellevue. Let's see, center median, on page 35, they talk about the center median. I added just comments to myself, decreases traffic speeds. It adds the tree canopy and cools things down. It adds identity. It also denotes it as a neighborhood versus a freeway. That's what I talk about. To the west of Lowell, it has character. We got to move that character towards the east. I think that's about it for that.
My only comment was on 35. I'd like to see something in there about regrading Bellevue between roughly Prince and Federal, because the westbound lanes in particular are I don't know how it got this way. They're very crowned. Yeah, it's awful, and it's unsafe. And with that, there's been a request to maybe take 5 before we sort of wrap up with the implementation thing. It is 8:40, so if we can reconvene in about 5 minutes at 8:45, we can try to wrap this up as close to 9 as we can. Okay? implementation, we can go around the room, or, I mean, I think we just treat this one as, you know, a single chapter, so Sherry, you got any comments on chapter 6?
Not yet.
Okay.
I may.
You want me to start the other one?
Yeah, or just
All right.
pass.
John, go ahead.
Just typo, the header says chapter 5.
What page?
Just the header. Instead of chapter 6, it says chapter 5.
Oh, yeah.
Big.
I didn't see that. Cool. Anything else? Right?
No. I like the way it's tied back to the original goals.
Yeah.
I like the way it's organized. I think it's,
Okay.
no,
We have a color code. Jason?
One thing that I was wondering about the improved mobility and safety. I mean, the map provides some general guidance on improvements to the corridor and different intersections. Do we see more specificity coming as the city's developing the multimodal transportation plan? Is that likely guidance on what we can expect? Okay.
I guess maybe a point of clarification. I mean, we can theoretically go back and amend this if we had more information from something like that, or Pell or whatever.
To that point, and then to earlier Robin's point at the beginning, I think that this is a plan that over time, once we have the vision piece, updates of the comprehensive plan, and the transportation master plan, which are all coming online by the end of next year, we can go back and add, or, you know what I mean, update this as needed based on those projects that are just getting underway. Because I think that we probably will.
Yeah. I expect you'll hear some comments about specificity in just a moment. Rob and I were talking a little bit about one thing I see is like strategy ID 5 is to codify the design standards for this area. This doesn't really get into the details of what precisely do we want the character to be, but it's saying there is a character and we should develop some regulations around that character.
But do you see that as part of this plan or as a follow-on project?
I think the plan identifies it as the follow-on project, is to develop those standards. That's what ID 5.
Well, be careful, because it says contained in the Bellevue Avenue corridor plan. That makes it seem like it's coming from this plan, not outside like you're talking about.
Right, and it's to codify the principles. You're saying, one of the things it talks about is stepping up density as you're moving away from the single-family residential. A design standard could say exactly how is that done. How many stories is it?
Yeah. I'm probably reading this a little differently, but I wanted to let you finish your job.
Yeah. No, that's.
Not disagreeing with what you're saying, but when I read this, when I see codify the building, this is the same strategy ID-5 on page is this 43. Codify the building design and site planning principles contained in the Bellevue Avenue corridor plan as part of the city zoning ordinance. Are you saying that that's something that will need to be developed? Because this really doesn't have that in here. So you're saying that should be developed.
So for example, on page 25, and these ideas about transitions, building massing and form, relationship to the street, all of those things, you don't necessarily have in your code today. And so these ideas are here. You could have a conversation with the developer about them, but you can't necessarily say, that's in our code, you have to do that. And so, that's a choice that the city can make to make that more of a formal code requirement in the future. Design standards they're just guidelines right now.
I'd love
Right,
some
I
of the
agree.
stuff that's in the appendix that talks about what are the design characteristics of the area. It's not necessarily in the plan itself, but the appendix identifies it uses a lot of words in this area. So maybe that's something that would be incorporated in the design standard or something.
because I still feel like this, it talks about creating a distinct identity, and I don't see this doing that. So when you talk about codifying it, I just see this as too nebulous to actually have a distinct identity coming from this. So that's my biggest concern about the plan. Others can obviously disagree with me, but I don't see it creating a distinct identity.
Maybe the word is wrong, distinct. We can give it improved identity, but I don't see it as being distinct ever.
There's a lot of variety in here.
Just creating an identity.
It's fine, and to me, you can still have a tremendous amount of variety, but still make it cohesive.
Is a cohesive identity a better way to, it's big, but it's not going to, I think cohesive is the public realm that kind of ties it together, because you're not going to have that consistency in the building form and design necessarily.
Yeah, I don't. To me, I just don't see the principal one being created from this. So that's why I have a hard time with it. I just don't see a distinct identity. I see wonderful improvements, the sense of the connectivity. They talk about the pedestrians and the improvement. There's lots of things that are being done that improve it, but I don't see it creating an identity. So that's probably where I get tripped on this right here. When you look at also for implementation, so when I think of the word implementation, it's kind of like a to-do list. And I think to have a to-do list, you have to have the strategy they're going about to create things. This corridor doesn't have design standards, and this doesn't create the design standards. If we really wanted to create some kind of distinct look, like just throwing out Santa Fe, it has the design standards we follow. It creates a distinct look. That's kind of more what I think of when I think of distinct identity. So maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're attempting to say there.
I'd like to hear from others on that, just in terms of where to go with. The identity piece, frankly, is the hardest piece of this. I think in terms of, we heard from a lot of folks in the community saying there's no way to create a distinctive identity for this corridor. So it's sort of trying to pull those pieces together as best you can. But I'd like to hear from others if, is there an opportunity that we're missing here? Is it just the terminology, or, I agree, maybe distinct is the wrong term. But I would like to hear other perspectives on that.
I'll just throw out.
Have some of that in there about the branding and the banners, and Littleton already has spent some effort and some money on developing the Littleton logo with the two little, what are they, tapeworms or banners? But anyway, it does. It does. You see that around town, and you're like, okay, I'm in Littleton. So just bringing some of that in there, and maybe adding another flair to that type of thing where people will identify those kind of wayfinding type of graphics that help you. Like you're driving by every day and you recognize them. You're just like, okay, I'm in this area again.
So, Robin, would you be more comfortable if there was just a simple listing of the characteristics that seem to identify what the character could be and what it might be? You go through and talk about streetscapes, like materials, architecture and scale, and just even identify the categories, and where we do have some similarities and where you have some of that established already, we can identify those perhaps. So.
Even identifying some of the established ones, but when I think about it, I'll look at Riverside Downs has a distinct identity. So when I hear that word, I want something describing, you can go in there and you describe the distinct identity of Riverside Downs in here. So I was looking for that in the corridor using, distinct identity. It's been brought up, part of the identities, there's a lot of the red brick there. Part of creating identity would, we talked to, the medium that, there's in there that Mark was expounding. Those things would create a distinct identity, but it's not called out altogether in a way to show that exists. It's like, if you talk about, there's some of the shopping areas there that are more run down, particularly, the area where the new owners want to spruce it up. And, well, how do they spruce it up to keep within a distinct identity? I see that opportunity lost because nothing in here really says that. It's not that you can tell them what to do, obviously, that's their property. But if you want to create a distinct identity, giving the guidelines, perhaps like you were talking about, Dennis, these are the ways to create that distinct identity, laying it out specifically in a manner where that could be used as an opportunity. Oh, I'm going to redo my shopping mall. This is distinct identity they're looking for here. I can incorporate that by doing whatever that is.
Okay.
My turn? Okay.
Do you have more?
That's probably enough.
I think it's a word problem here. Distinct is not the right word, and I'm gagging over which cohesive, no. Distinct, definitely not. If I used a word like improve, that's too nebulous. So I think, between now and 2 days from now, come up with the right word there. But something more than whatever for Bellevue Avenue and distinct. What's that middle ground? So I'll leave it at that. Under strategies, principle 1 strategies, I would add a strategy ID-6. Add calming strategies, traffic calming strategies, such as, you can use whatever Flannery's language you want. Calming strategies such as center median landscape between Federal and Prince. That's the third time I brought up that point. Principle 2, really important. I love that you have it in here. Develop an updated citywide comprehensive plan, which we are now doing, which is great. And updates to the Centennial and Goddard neighborhood plans, which were last done when Reagan was still president. Be done every 10 years. We do things a little slow here, every 30 years or so, 35 years. Principle 3, NR5 and NR6 concern me a little bit as an architect. When you talk about exploring interest in future design guideline standards for residential infill and redevelopment, are we talking about larger parcels, or are we talking about individual lots? Where right now, like I'm in an R1, I design, as long as I stay within zoning requirements, I go to the building department. I don't go before the committee that tells me what color, what style, the Santa Fe style, or is it the Victorian style? What are we talking about there?
So I think it's talking about the neighborhood more broadly. I think that there's recognition that those neighborhoods are relatively intact in terms of the scale of the homes, and a lot of them are original. And so going back to what we heard from the neighborhoods, I think there's different ways to do design guidelines. They don't necessarily have to be style specific, but I think someone brought up earlier, Robin, I think you did. If someone wants to do a big max out their zoning currently next to what's now a 15-foot high single-family home. It's just a question, I think, in terms of what we heard from the neighborhood. Is that a direction they want to go or not? We don't have an answer to that question. It's one way that you could protect neighborhood character, and that would require a more in-depth conversation with the neighborhood.
But it's in here, and it makes me nervous. As was mentioned before, you got 30-foot height limit. You could pop the top. You could scrape the lot, scrape the house on the lot, and build max out the site, 50% lot coverage, whatever you can do in an R2. Everybody has that right in that R2 area. We're talking about doing, making that a historic area and saying everything's going to be one story. But the hint is there, and it bothers me. I'll just leave it at that.
Sure. No, I think the question is there, is that, we heard the comment about the character of the neighborhoods. That's one way to protect neighborhood character. Some people think having the ability to do pop-tops everywhere is a great thing. Other people don't until, aren't aware that potential is there until it starts to happen around them, and then it becomes an issue. And so it's a way of just having a conversation sooner than later to know whether you want to go there or not. I don't think there's any pretense that you should go there. I think it's a question. Should it come out, or should it be changed, or other thoughts on?
That's my thought. I don't know what other thoughts are. I don't like it in there, I guess.
Discussion to have.
Surprise!
I'll continue here. Let's see, Principle 4, I love Strategy R2. I love facade enhancement grants. West 38th Avenue, as you go from Denver and you cross Sheridan, you go into Wheat Ridge, it's like, whoa, what's happened here? They have grants for property and facade improvements, which have been used. It's a light and day much better than the Denver portion of West 38th. That would be a lovely, tool to improve.
On Principle 4, is that what you said?
I'm sorry?
Principle 4, you said?
Yes, Principle 4.
Okay.
Strategy R2.
Okay.
Strategy R4 on the same, I have double check mark. That to me is, anyway, it's another tool to improve the visual aspects of the corridor. And that's it for me.
Okay, I think that's covered a lot of it. Anybody have any comments? Do we want to go through the appendix briefly? Does anybody have any comments about the appendix? Appendices?
Before we get to that, back to your point and what Robin was saying, I have under the MS2 where it talks about the update to the citywide comprehensive plan, it's under mobility and fleet. So I would offer that we take that second sentence where it talks about, which I know it's important to do transportation or whatnot for the neighborhoods, but maybe somehow that gets incorporated over into NR5 and we figure out a way to kind of slightly reword that, Mark, so that we get to your concern, but we don't lose the idea.
I don't mind losing the idea.
NR5. So that's, then maybe it keeps that.
A great catch.
Right. Which strategy on Principle 2 did you talk about incorporating that with?
MS2 to NR5.
So the last sentence
Second
under
sentence
MS2.
on MS2, we're talking about Centennial and Goddard neighborhood plans and moving that to incorporate it under Principle 3, which is talking about the neighborhoods, NR5, and put that in there, and then talk about, one of the ideas could be talking about design elements within those neighborhood plans.
But we single out Goddard, but what about Aberdeen Village or Heritage? Where does that go?
We're just talking about these for now, so it would be
I know.
Goddard and Centennial.
I like your suggestion. I think it's very good.
Yep.
Okay. All right, anything else with respect to the body of the thing? And do we want to, I guess it's fair game. Does anybody have any substantive comments with respect to the appendices?
Well, the retail analysis is one of the better ones I've ever seen. This is really good. This is a wow compared to some others.
I had one question on appendix. I don't see the page numbers on this thing. You might want to stick up page numbers on the appendices.
They're in the middle on this one, so.
Oh, yeah, no, you're right. There they are. Okay. So 11 then, page 11 of appendix A. On the right-hand side, it talks about South Suburban Parks and Rec kicking off a process in early 2018 focused on improving access to the river corridor. So we're probably past early 2018. I'm not sure I know what that is. Is that, what is it they're doing with respect to, I don't know if this is part of the master plan. I assume if there's something going on, it's part of the master plan. What are they doing?
So when we met with them last fall, they mentioned that they were going to be looking at specifically kind of overlapping with our corridor, getting people to the river. So a lot of the same objectives we were talking about, but when we last talked with them, one of our community meetings early this year, they were just sending out an RFP, so it was a more detailed planning process. I don't know the specifics of it, but it was something that they were going to be doing.
Maybe the way to handle that
Visualize
is just
it a little bit.
to kill the dates and just say they're focused on improving the access.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, okay, that's what. Jump in as, if you guys have more.
I just had one comment. It's on page 7 of the report there, under the housing options. I agree with the issue of housing affordability, but I get a little leery about adding something like accessory dwelling units, as our community hasn't really talked about that yet. I'd rather not see something that the community hasn't had a chance to really think about thrown in like that.
I'd love to see something thrown in like that. I think the plan is the opportunity for it.
I think Brittany, I just think the community has to cash that out, because a lot of people are very vehemently against it. A lot of people are very vehemently for it, and that hasn't really been discussed.
What page do you see that on?
Oh, it's on
Page 7
of the...
7?
Yeah.
Kind of keep in mind, this is the background. It's not specifically called out in the plan per se.
I agree, but I'd just like the community to have an opportunity before something like that's thrown in. That's just one person's opinion. Agreed to
Any other comments for the appendices?
I have just one question on the Parks and Recreation and also transportation sections.
What pages?
Just the section that talks about issues on both of those. Is maintenance and budget for infrastructure appropriate thing to mention as far as an issue for this type of document?
Sure. I mean, it's not something we heard resources are limited. We need to try to work with our other partner agencies, but I think, that issue didn't necessarily come up specifically, so we didn't call it out, but.
What is the issue?
The maintenance and, of existing infrastructure, how that impacts the city's budget and...
It essentially doesn't overtly, because it's all pretty much done by South Suburban. So, we pay South Suburban fee, and they actually get money through mill levies, periodic increases, and so forth and so on.
For the parks.
Yeah, exactly. But
for the transportation, the city's probably.
For the street.
Transportation?
Yeah. For roadways and sidewalks. Roadways and sidewalks.
Oh, okay.
I mentioned both of those.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Yeah, so, pretty clearly, that would be something that would certainly be a capital projects fund.
So I don't know, just, that might be something to...
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Okay, since it is, any other final commentary, let's put it that way. I think this has been a lot of quality content in terms of, I think the document, as I said earlier, I think we all said, the document you guys gave us was a very credible effort, and I think in terms of providing a lot of substantive feedback that is reflective of our thought processes, you've got it. We're looking forward to the next draft, but all in, well done. And same to the team. I think you guys, the commissioners, did an outstanding job of going through this in depth and really putting the sweat equity into coming up with a version, the next version being substantially enhanced relative to what you guys did to work. You want me to throw it back to you for final?
No, I would say the same thing.
Okay.
I was at the break, I was saying I'm really enjoying working with this group, and you all had great comments. Everybody's working hard, and everybody's prepared, which is is lovely. And hopefully what we've given you will be helpful. It'll be interesting to compare our notes to the next draft and see what you edited out as preposterous or every comment we have is gold. So.
I think we got a lot of good comments, so we really appreciate all the feedback.
I mean, some of them are coming late, and you know I'm sure you came in here thinking, hopefully thinking that this is perfect as is, but it needs a little more work.
It never happens that way, so I think we expect that, and that, I mean, until you see it all together, it's hard to have those specific comments, so we appreciate that. That's nice.
But good job.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice. Jocelyn, do you have any, I think we're done with that. Are there any follow-on comments or staff reports or anything else we need to be aware of?
No, I'll just echo everything. Good conversation tonight, and we'll keep working through your comments, so thank you very much for that.
What's coming up at the next meeting?
And yes, just quickly at your next meeting, so your next meeting technically falls on Memorial Day, so it's scheduled for that Wednesday, May 30th. And we do have 2 items on that agenda. One is another P4 application, and then we think we'll confirm tomorrow if the downtown design standards, if there's a review of the final draft with Historic Preservation Board, but that's tentatively the second item on that agenda. So that's
any final commissioner thoughts? I think we're done. Thanks very much.